Right now everybody is about, okay, this is the German startup champion. This is from France. France has that many unicorns. Estonia has that many unicorns. And this is what we want to get away from.
How do we bring the European startup ecosystem up to the level of the United States? Exactly this question is what Rise Europe is meant to answer. Today on the podcast, we have Marisa Schneider from Unternehmertum. She and Unternehmertum are leading a group of 20 of the biggest European multiplier organizations and universities, names like ETH Zurich, Oxford University, and they are bringing up our startup ecosystem to the next level. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us about this.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to really dive into this quickly because this is kind of fascinating what Rise Europe is. So at first it was a conference on May 17th, if I have that right.
Correct.
And it was over 20 leading startup multipliers, universities, names like ETH Zurich, Oxford University, some really big names. First, give us an idea of what Rise Europe is and what it's meant to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So to the listeners that have been listening to your podcast before, they might already be familiar with Unternehmertum, which today is actually Europe's largest tech entrepreneurship center. And behind the center stands Susanne Klatten, who is the major shareholder of BMW and the wealthiest woman in Germany. So we're very lucky that she's backing Unternehmertum. We're kind of her startup from back then. And she recently said in the news, Unternehmertum has been on a really good journey the past years, and we want to be on top when it comes to bringing forth startups and unicorns, but we don't want to be alone on top. So we want to take Europe with us. So now Unternehmertum has grown so big and so strong that we are looking across borders and we are looking at how can we transform Europe for sustainable growth, right? Like we're living in a time with so much crisis in the world and so much uncertainty when it comes to politics and economy. We need innovation, and especially tech innovation. And that's my job at Unternehmertum, to bring together our European partners. So we've been looking at Europe and looking for like-minded entrepreneurship centers and universities out there that we want to join forces with now in Rise Europe, which is the new European network of entrepreneurship centers at Unternehmertum.
That's cool. I like that. So it's bringing people up with you as you go on your way up. Now let's talk a little bit about the conference itself that you had about a month ago. What were some of the outcomes? What were you doing, and what came out of that conference?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, it was like 4 weeks ago now. We went to the Bavarian Alps, to Elmau, to Schloss Elmau, which is very well known through the meetings of the G7 summits. So we figured, okay, this is like the perfect environment. This is kind of setting the tone for this conference. We really want to make an impact, and we want to get decision makers there. And we went to Schloss Elmau for 3 days. And basically, it was the very first time we brought together this group, right? So all these 23 decision makers and the leaders from these entrepreneurship centers and universities met for the very first time. So it was both, of course, getting to know each other to eventually grow together, but of course also to figure out how can we actually work together. Many of us have been working together before on individual projects, like EU-funded projects, but not in this kind of way to bring together a whole new network. And basically, we've come up with like 3 verticals on how we want to work together and what is it exactly that we want to achieve. Like the main ambition with Rise Europe is to create more European tech startup champions. And how do we do that? First, we need to build our community, so Rise Europe. How do we do that? Well, we want to leverage our existing events better. Like all of these institutions and countries have amazing startup conferences. Like you have Slash in Helsinki, or you have the Bits and Pretzels in Munich. And we need to use these conferences to make our startups visible. And the way in is so easy if you know each other. And we need to make sure that this group still meets. So again, in 1 year, we're going to meet in Madrid for the next Rise Europe Summit. And the other part, of course, is the focus on the startups, the actual hands-on startup support. And here, the major topic is market entry. So we're also looking at how do we bring forward the next generation of founders. But one important aspect of building these European tech startup champions is the scale-up phase. So we need to look at how can we make it easier for our growing startups to enter the market quicker. And this is how the network should help us with. So we have like a task force in place looking at what does the market need and how can we connect our startups better to the local industry to get them the first customer or partnership in another European country. And the third part is that we want to communicate more as a European startup ecosystem. You know, right now everybody is about, okay, this is the German startup champion. This is from France. France has that many unicorns. Estonia has that many unicorns. And this is what we want to get away from. We want to get to the point that startups say, hey, I'm a European startup. And just last year in Europe, startups have raised over 7 billion euros. These are numbers that we need to get out there, and we need to get away from this like country-specific numbers. There's so much power and innovation in Europe, and we need sort of like a European pitch to make this visible.
I think you have quite a task ahead of you, because there's all of those feelings of, national identity and everything, but it's nice to see organizations pushing forward with European identity, particularly in the startup community. I think that's very admirable. Now, as I understand it, over the next year, each of these organizations that are part of Rise Europe are meant to nominate 10 of the most meaningful startups that they will then get further support. Does every institution get to have their own criteria of what a meaningful startup is meant to be, or do you have shared criteria? Is it a mix between the two? How does that work?
Yes, you're right. Every institution nominated the 10 most meaningful startups of the year. And most meaningful does not have to mean the most successful as of right now. So not the startups that have raised the most VC money in the last year. It means like the personal watch list of that entrepreneurship center or university. They know their startups best, and they can evaluate best who has the most potential to become the next European startup champion. The criteria from that point of view is so the personal watch list, but also from a specific industry. So we're only in the tech sector, right? So we're looking especially on the fields of energy resilience, aerospace, quantum, green technologies, really, that really can have an impact in Europe.
Once they get accepted for this program, what kind of support are they going to receive?
So Rise Europe is a network, so it's not a program that startups apply for. It's rather that we use this landscape of these startups now so that we have better transparency of whom do we want to support. Like you wouldn't believe, like even at an entrepreneurship center as Unternehmertum, we have to ask ourselves the question, what are actually the most successful unicorns in France right now? And not everybody can answer that question. And we need to make this transparent, which are the most potential startups right now. And we're bringing these into the network now. So now I've been talking to the UK and to Sweden and to France, and we're looking at this list and we're saying, okay, we need to set up the first calls with these startups and talk to them and see where they stand. And then, I mean, these the managing directors from these entrepreneurship centers, they have the best network in their respective countries. So they are the key point to establish the contact to potential customers or partners.
If you get nominated and accepted as startup XYZ from Unternehmertum, that Unternehmertum already has a relationship with, now you're not just getting Unternehmertum's network, you're also getting access to ETH Zurich, and you're getting access to Oxford University and all of the other participants in this. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes.
That's a strong network. Now, once they're in this program, or not really a program, in this network, as you said, do the startups have to give anything? Are they just getting help just from the network, or do they have to give back in the form of mentorship? Do they need to give equity? What does it look like for responsibilities from the startups side?
I think the main responsibility is to communicate. First off, like openness to really also at the early stage already identify as European startup. Some startups still have the mindset of, okay, I first need to establish myself in the home market, and it's not really time yet to look across borders. So definitely a change of mindset in that sense, but then also to communicate, because most startups also learn from other startups. So when we are using our network and we're bringing like a Munich startup to Sweden, for example, we're hoping that the Swedish startups will join in the communication with this German startup and tell them about their learning journey.
Right. So not just the institutions giving out their network, but also you're getting the network of the startup. So it really, really does become a very interconnected network. Now, one of the stated goals from Rise Europe is to bring Europe up, the startup ecosystem, up to the level of some other startup superpowers, I guess we can call them. So namely, I'm sure the US is in view there, but maybe other nations like the UK and Israel. These are a little bit closer in peer nations at the moment to some of the countries we have in Europe. What would that actually look like if we could actually bring Europe up to the level of the United States? Like, how do we know when that's happened?
So when we talk about level, I would say like it's the level of innovativeness. And like one number where you can see this happening is in the number of unicorns, right? So I think last year, the US had over 600 unicorns, and Germany, I mean, still they're on the 5th place, but the number is, I think, 36 in last year, 2022. So there's still a way to go. And I think Europe's ambition should also be not just any unicorns, but really unicorns that are in the fields that really have a true impact. So we don't want the next online fashion retailer, but we want someone who can solve the climate crisis.
Yeah, this sort of innovative culture, I think, is definitely growing in Europe, but it certainly has a long way to go before we could say that we're on the same level as the United States. What about raw numbers of startups? Just lots and lots of small startups. Is this important to Rise Europe, or is this kind of secondary?
I would say it's secondary, but it's definitely important. I mean, within Rise Europe, you have many universities as well, and their main task is to still motivate for entrepreneurship. But I think it's not the main problem that we have in Europe. We have many startups and we have many founders. It's really about the second stage. We need to help them to scale, and we need speed. We need to help them scale quicker. But definitely, to create unicorns, you need to water the small plants, right? And so motivation for entrepreneurship is and will always be key at universities.
Sticking with this thought, beyond Rise Europe, so Rise Europe is one organization, really interesting moving forward, but beyond that, what do you see as necessary, things that need to happen here inside of Europe to bring Europe up to that next level? So I'm thinking like investment, ecosystem development, a mentality shift, as you were talking about, government help. Like, what are some of the building blocks that we might have in place but need to grow?
So first off is the mindset shift that you mentioned. So we see in a lot of countries that the ecosystems do not work so well as they do, for example, in Munich. So when you talk to Austria, for example, you see there is so much more potential for the university to work together with corporates and the public sector. So public-private partnership is still something that needs to grow a lot in many European countries. So that's the one thing. Then it's definitely the part of risk-taking. You mentioned investments. We need more investments to raise to the level of the US. There is no question about that. And then I think the universities play a key role. Like Europe has great universities, but to focus on research, yes, it's important, it's very great, but there also needs to happen the change that they go into commercialization, that the great ideas that the researchers and PhD candidates come up with in their thesis, we need to help them get this onto the market.
Okay. Last question about this. What do you see as some of the advantages or some of the things that Europe has that the United States doesn't? What are, the unique selling propositions of Europe, of brand Europe?
I think, well, being from Europe myself, I think it's like an amazing place to be. Like I love traveling and seeing the world, but I'm so happy that I'm from Europe, because it's such it's a place so rich of history and culture and languages. So there is so much diversity. So when we speak about creating one European startup ecosystem or one European market, it will always be very diverse. And yes, this makes it, on the one hand, very hard on the bureaucratic side. This is one of the things that needs to change. But it also makes it very rich in potential. Like what brings us together is the same values, I would say, in Europe. But yeah, the different countries and the bureaucracy, it makes it very difficult.
Sure. So I like that idea, though. The idea that, yes, having a whole bunch of different cultures and different languages, it can be logistically challenging, but it's also a strength because of the different, the diversity of opinion, of thought, of culture. This can be a strength too. I like that, and I think we'll end our discussion on that high note. But the last thing that we should ask you is, if people want to stay up to date on Rise Europe and its progress, then how do they get in touch? Where should they look?
So check out the Unternehmertum website, where we inform about Rise Europe. And there's a lot in the media actually right now, not only in the German media, but especially in France and UK as well, reporting on Rise Europe. So everybody should stay tuned about our upcoming activities.
Certainly. And maybe we can have you back in a year's time and you can give us an update after the next conference.
Yeah, that would be great.
Sounds like fun. Then, Marisa, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was very enlightening, and this is a very worthy goal. Very excited to see how this goes over the next year or two.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody, for listening and watching. If you want to know more about Rise Europe, then, of course, look in the show notes. And if you want to help out Startup Knockout, like, comment, and share wherever you're able. Thanks so much again. We'll see you next time.